As I pulled up to the elegant, glass-walled building housing Prestwick Automotive Group's annual shareholder meeting, I could feel my heart racing beneath my tailored Chanel suit. Through the windshield of my vintage Aston Martin DB5, once Robert's prized possession, I watched my estranged husband's expression transform from smugly confident to utterly stunned as he recognized both me and the car. 3 years ago, he'd abandoned our 15-year marriage for his 24-year-old assistant, mockingly telling me I was too unsophisticated to understand his world of luxury car investments. Today, as the majority shareholder of the prestigious auto collection he'd built his identity around, I was about to announce his removal from the board. And the car I drove up in? Just the beginning of what he was about to lose. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The valet approached with reverence, his eyes widening at the iconic silver vehicle. Absolutely stunning, ma'am. The '64 DB5 is a masterpiece. Thank you, I replied, handing him the keys. James Bond's car of choice, though I prefer to drive it myself rather than deploy the ejector seat. His laugh was genuine as he placed a ticket in my hand. I'll keep it front and center, Ms. Harrington. That name, my maiden name, still, felt both foreign and familiar on my tongue after years as Mrs. Catherine Prestwick. But reclaiming it had been the first step in reclaiming everything else. I paused at the building entrance, watching Robert through the glass walls as he stood frozen on the terrace, champagne flute suspended halfway to his lips. Beside him stood Amber Williams, formerly his executive assistant, now his fiancée, her hand possessively clutching his arm as she followed his gaze to me. Even from this distance, I could see her perfectly arranged features contort with confusion. Before I share how this moment came to be, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories of resilience and reinvention, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The atrium of Prestwick Automotive Group headquarters was a monument to automotive luxury. Rare vintage models rotated on platforms beneath carefully calibrated lighting, each vehicle more valuable than most people's homes. Executives and investors mingled among the automotive treasures, crystal flutes in hand, celebrating another record year for the company that had become the premier broker and curator of investment-grade automobiles. I felt the room shift as I entered. Conversations stalled mid-sentence, eyes darted in my direction, then quickly away. I was both familiar and unexpected. A ghost from the company's past suddenly materialized in physical form. Catherine? The voice belonged to Martin Chen, PAG's chief financial officer, and one of the few executives who had maintained cordial relations with me after Robert's betrayal. We didn't expect, that is, your name wasn't on the attendance list? I supplied with a smile, extending my hand which he shook automatically. No, I imagine it wasn't. But as a major shareholder, I have standing invitation rights. Martin's eyes widened slightly at the word major. In the world of corporate gamesmanship, information was currency, and I had just revealed a hand he hadn't known I was holding. Of course, he recovered smoothly. It's good to see you. You look well. Thank you, Martin. I am well. The unspoken question hung between us. Why now, after 3 years of absence, had I chosen to appear? And in Robert's prized Aston Martin, no less. Across the room, Robert had recovered enough to move from the terrace back inside, Amber trailing behind him, like an exquisite shadow. At 32, he was 27 years her senior, though you wouldn't know it from his meticulously maintained appearance. The personal trainer, the subtle cosmetic touch-ups, the expensive haircuts that disguised the gray. He navigated through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and clapping shoulders, his public face firmly back in place despite the shock I'd just delivered. I could pinpoint the exact moment he decided to confront me. A slight straightening of his shoulders, a determined tilt of his chin. Robert had always believed in controlling the narrative, and my unexpected appearance had thrown his carefully orchestrated event into disarray. Catherine. His voice carried that familiar blend of charm and authority that had once made my heart race for very different reasons. What an unexpected surprise. Robert. I met his gaze evenly. Lovely event. The new Ferrari Daytona SP3 makes quite the centerpiece. His eyes narrowed slightly at my casual reference to the limited production vehicle that had been recently acquired. I wasn't aware you'd developed an interest in automotive investments. Oh, I've become quite knowledgeable about many things in the past few years. I sipped my champagne. Your Aston Martin drives beautifully, by the way. Thank you for maintaining it so meticulously. The muscle in his jaw twitched, a tell I'd learned to recognize during our marriage, a sign that his composure was slipping. That's my personal vehicle, Catherine. I don't recall giving you permission to drive it. I smiled with genuine amusement. That's an interesting perspective, Robert. We should discuss ownership details after the shareholder meeting. I believe you're about to present the annual report? Before he could respond, Diane Blackwood, the company's corporate secretary, approached with purpose. Mr. Prestwick, we're ready to begin. The shareholders are taking their seats. Robert hesitated, clearly torn between addressing my provocative statement and fulfilling his duties as chairman. Duty one, as I'd known it would. Robert Prestwick had built his reputation on impeccable timing and flawless performances, particularly in front of those who controlled the company's capital. We'll continue this conversation later, he said with a tight smile, then turned to follow Diane toward the presentation area. Amber lingered, her gaze sliding over me with calculated assessment. Catherine, you look different. Retail therapy after the divorce must have been extensive. The catty remark was delivered with a saccharine smile. 3 years ago, it might have landed like a slap. Now, it barely registered. Amber, lovely to see you too. Congratulations on your promotion from assistant to fiancé. That's quite the corporate ladder you've climbed. Her smile faltered as I turned away to find my seat in the front row of the shareholder section, a placement that would ensure Robert would have to look at me throughout his entire presentation. As I settled in, I felt a momentary pang of something not quite regret, but perhaps recognition of how far we'd both traveled from where we began. The elegant boardroom of Prestwick Automotive Group had once felt like a second home. For 15 years, I had been the supportive wife who organized the client appreciation events, remembered the children's names of business associates, and maintained the social calendar that had been crucial to Robert's networking. I had been the perfect corporate spouse, gracious, discreet, and unfailingly supportive of my husband's ambitions. When I first met Robert Prestwick at a charity auction in Boston, I'd been a 25-year-old art history graduate working for a small gallery. He was 38, already successful, confident without being arrogant, and possessed a genuine passion for automotive design that transcended mere status symbolism. He spoke about the curves of a Ferrari 250 GTO with the same reverence I reserved for discussing Botticelli. Our worlds were different but complementary, his commercial success and my artistic appreciation creating a balance that seemed perfect. The lines of a truly great car, he told me on our third date as we walked through his modest but carefully curated collection, are the intersection of engineering necessity and artistic vision. Form follows function, but transcends it too. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I fell in love with the man who could see beauty in practical things, who valued aesthetics alongside performance. We married 11 months later, and I embraced his world wholeheartedly. As Robert's presentation began, detailing Prestwick Automotive Group's record year of acquisitions and sales, I found myself studying his masterful performance, the confidence, the command of intricate financial details, the subtle humor that put his audience at ease. The qualities that had once impressed me now seemed mechanical, a well-rehearsed routine designed to maintain his carefully constructed persona. The accompanying slides showed gleaming automobiles, Ferraris, Bugattis, rare Porsches, and limited edition Aston Martins, each representing millions in investment. The company had started modestly, but had grown into the premier broker for ultra-high net worth individuals seeking to invest in automotive assets. Our client portfolio has expanded 32% this year alone, Robert announced, pride evident in his voice. We've curated collections for 3 new billionaire clients and expanded services for 12 existing clients with net worth exceeding $500 million each. The shareholders nodded appreciatively. Automotive assets had proven remarkably resilient, even in unstable markets, and Prestwick had positioned itself as the trusted advisor to the ultra-wealthy looking to diversify their investment portfolios with tangible assets that also delivered emotional returns. What Robert didn't know, what none of them knew except for my team of attorneys and financial advisors, was that the ownership structure of the company's most valuable asset was about to undergo a dramatic reorganization. As Robert concluded his presentation to appreciative applause, I felt a curious detachment watching him bask in the adulation. This man who had once been the center of my world was now almost a stranger, his familiar gestures and expressions belonging to someone I used to know intimately but now observed with clinical remove. The moment the formal presentation ended, Patricia Winters, the lead director, rose to address the gathering. Before we move to the general reception, we have one additional item on our agenda today. As some of you may be aware, there have been significant changes in the company's ownership structure that need to be addressed. Robert's head turned sharply toward Patricia, confusion evident in his expression. This was not part of the carefully planned agenda he had reviewed and approved. I'd like to introduce Ms. Eleanor Chen from Blackwood Partners, who represents a significant new investor in Prestwick Automotive Group, Patricia continued. Eleanor Chen, a striking woman in her 50s with an impeccable reputation in corporate restructuring, approached the podium with measured confidence. Her gaze briefly met mine before addressing the room. Thank you, Patricia. I'll be brief as I know everyone is eager to enjoy the reception. Her voice carried the perfect blend of authority and cordiality. Blackwood Partners, in conjunction with Harrington Heritage Fund, has acquired a controlling interest in the Prestwick Classic Collection, which, as you know, constitutes approximately 65% of the company's tangible assets and serves as collateral for much of its operational financing. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Robert stood frozen beside the podium, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as the implications began to register. Effective immediately, the ownership restructuring will necessitate changes to the board composition and executive leadership, Eleanor continued. Ms. Catherine Harrington, as the principal of Harrington Heritage Fund, will assume the position of chairperson of the newly formed Asset Management Division, which will have direct oversight of the Prestwick Classic Collection. All eyes turned to me as I rose from my seat, feeling the weight of the moment I had spent 3 years methodically working toward. Thank you, Eleanor, I said, taking my place at the podium. I look forward to working with the board to ensure the continued appreciation of these extraordinary automotive assets. Robert stepped forward, his composure visibly cracking. "This is absolutely," he began, but Patricia smoothly intercepted him. "Details of the restructuring have been provided to board members and will be discussed in full at tomorrow's emergency board meeting. For now, let's proceed with the reception as planned." As the stunned audience began to disperse toward the reception area, Robert finally managed to maneuver through the crowd toward me, his face flushed with a combination of anger and disbelief. "What the hell is going on, Catherine?" he demanded, in a harsh whisper. "This is my company, my collection." I met his gaze calmly. "Actually, Robert, there's been a significant misunderstanding about ownership that's persisted for quite some time. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. My office now." He turned abruptly, expecting me to follow as I always had during our marriage. I paused long enough to make it clear that I was choosing to accompany him rather than obeying a command, then followed him toward the executive elevator. As the doors closed, leaving us alone for the first time in nearly 3 years, the air between us crackled with unspoken accusations and questions. The man who had once been my husband, who had built his reputation on never being caught off guard, was struggling to process how thoroughly the control he prized had just been wrested away. And we hadn't even gotten to the part about his precious Aston Martin collection yet. The 30-second elevator ride to the top floor stretched into what felt like minutes, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the elevator machinery and Robert's increasingly agitated breathing. I maintained my composure, drawing strength from the knowledge that every detail of what was unfolding had been meticulously planned and legally vetted. When the doors finally opened to the executive floor, Robert strode purposefully toward his corner office, his Italian leather shoes clicking aggressively against the marble flooring. I followed at a measured pace, taking in the surroundings that had changed significantly since I'd last visited. The artwork had been replaced. The warm, classic pieces we had selected together during our travels now substituted with more ostentatious contemporary works that screamed wealth rather than taste. It was a small detail, but telling. Robert's office itself had undergone a similar transformation. The comfortable elegance I'd helped create had been replaced with a colder, more imposing aesthetic. All glass, chrome, and stark minimalism. Behind his massive desk, where family photos had once stood, there was now only a scale model of the Ferrari 250 GTO, the crown jewel of automotive collecting, with examples selling for upwards of $70 million when they rarely came to market. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to one of the sleek chairs positioned in front of his desk. I remained standing. "I'll stand, thank you." His jaw tightened at this small defiance. Robert was accustomed to being obeyed, particularly in this space that had been designed to emphasize his authority. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Catherine?" he demanded, not bothering to sit either. "This company, this collection, I've spent my life building this. You can't just walk in here with some hedge fund and stage a hostile takeover." "It's not a hostile takeover, Robert," I replied calmly. "It's a clarification of ownership that should have been addressed years ago. The Prestwick Classic Collection was never solely yours to begin with." He scoffed, the sound harsh in the stark space. "That's absurd. I founded this company. I cultivated every client relationship. I personally selected every vehicle in that collection. With funds from our joint accounts," I countered. "With capital that included my inheritance from my father, which you insisted we combine for greater investment opportunity. With the proceeds from the gallery, I sold at your urging so I could focus on supporting your career." The color drained slightly from his face as fragments of long-forgotten conversations resurfaced in his memory. The original purchase, agreements for the first 12 vehicles in the collection, the foundation of everything that came after, were signed by both of us, I continued. The offshore holding company that legally owns those vehicles and the 40 acquired subsequently? I'm listed as co-director with equal voting rights. Rights I never exercised because I trusted you to act in our mutual interest. Robert's expression shifted from disbelief to calculation. He had always been quick to reassess and adapt to changing circumstances. It was what made him successful in business. Catherine, if this is about money, it's not about money, I interrupted, the first hint of emotion cracking my carefully maintained composure. It's about recognition. It's about consequences for choices made. It's about the fact that 3 years ago, you didn't just leave me for a younger woman. You attempted to erase my contributions to everything we built together. He moved around the desk, adopting the more conciliatory tone he reserved for difficult negotiations. I acknowledge that my personal decisions caused you pain. The divorce settlement was generous precisely because I recognized your supportive role in my success. Supportive role, I repeated, the words tasting bitter. That's exactly the problem, Robert. You never saw me as a partner, just as an accessory, decorative, and useful but fundamentally dispensable when a newer model caught your eye. Robert's face hardened at the automotive metaphor. That's unfair. Our marriage had been struggling for years before Amber. We had grown apart. You knew that. What I knew was that we faced the normal challenges of any long-term relationship, I countered. What I didn't know was that while I was working to address those challenges, you were cultivating an exit strategy with your 24-year-old assistant. He sighed with practiced patience. I didn't come to the office today to relitigate our divorce. What exactly do you want, Catherine? To punish me? To embarrass me in front of my shareholders? To damage the company out of spite? What I want, I said, taking a seat finally and indicating he should do the same, is for us to have an honest conversation about the future of Prestwick Automotive Group and the collection at its heart. Robert sat slowly, wariness evident, in his posture. He had always been able to charm, manipulate, or overpower his way through difficult situations. But for perhaps the first time, he was facing someone who was immune to all three approaches, someone who knew him too well and had nothing to lose. You've made your point, he said after a moment. You've blindsided me today, achieved whatever emotional satisfaction you were seeking. Now let's discuss a reasonable resolution that doesn't damage what we both helped build. I smiled, recognizing the negotiating tactic I'd observed countless times during our marriage, the strategic concession designed to facilitate a more favorable final position. I'm absolutely committed to not damaging the collection or the company, Robert. Unlike you, I believe in preserving what we created together. For the next hour, we engaged in the most honest conversation we'd had in perhaps a decade. I outlined the restructuring plan that Eleanor Chen and my team had developed, a plan that would leave the operational aspects of Prestwick Automotive Group largely intact while transferring oversight of the classic car collection to the new asset management division I would chair. Your expertise in acquisition and client relationships remains valuable, I explained. No one's suggesting you be removed from day-to-day operations. But the critical decisions about the collection, what to acquire, what to sell, how to leverage, the assets, those will require my approval going forward. Robert listened with growing resignation as I detailed the legal documentation that supported my position. Documentation his own attorneys would soon confirm left him little room to contest the restructuring without a protracted and potentially damaging legal battle. "And the Aston Martin?" he finally asked, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "The one you drove here today?" "The DB5 was purchased with funds from my father's estate," I replied. "It's registered under the same holding company as the rest of the collection, but the purchase documentation specifically notes it was acquired with my inherited funds. It's mine, Robert. It always was." He flinched slightly, whether from the revelation itself or from the realization of how thoroughly he had underestimated me, I couldn't be sure. "Does Amber know?" I asked, unable to resist the question. "Does she know that the collection you've built your identity around isn't entirely yours? That the cars you've promised as collateral for your new ventures aren't solely your assets? To leverage?" His silence was answer enough. As our conversation concluded and I prepared to leave his office, Robert asked one final question. "Why now, Catherine? It's been 3 years. Why wait until today?" I paused at the door, considering my response carefully. I needed time to fully understand what we had built together, not just as your wife, but as an equal partner with financial and legal standing. I needed to become the businesswoman you never believed I could be. I smiled slightly. And I needed to learn to drive the DB5 properly. It's quite temperamental, as I'm sure you know. As I stepped out of his office, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not the vindictive satisfaction I might once have imagined, but something more complex and ultimately more valuable. The knowledge that I had finally claimed my rightful place in the narrative of my own life. The ripples from that day's revelation extended far beyond the Prestwick Automotive Group headquarters. By evening, industry publications had picked up the story of the ownership clarification at one of the world's most prestigious automotive investment firms. By the following morning, Robert's carefully cultivated image as the sole visionary behind the company had been irrevocably altered. "Prestwick co-founder returns to claim stake in luxury car empire," read the headline in the Financial Times. The Wall Street Journal was more direct. "Ex-wife's return shifts control of billion-dollar classic car collection." As I sat in my apartment overlooking Boston Harbor the morning after the shareholder meeting, sipping coffee and reviewing the media coverage, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment of reckoning, not just with Robert, but with myself and the passive role I had accepted for too long in my own life. The apartment itself was symbolic of my transformation. Unlike the sprawling suburban mansion Robert and I had shared during our marriage, a house I had never truly felt at home in despite my efforts to make it ours, this space was entirely mine. Contemporary but warm, filled with the art I loved, and the books that had sustained me through the darkest days of my reinvention. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the harbor I found endlessly calming. The constant movement of vessels large and small, a reminder that nothing remained static unless you allowed it to. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor Chen. "Board meeting in 1 hour. Ready?" "Absolutely," I replied, setting aside my coffee and moving toward the bedroom to prepare for my first official appearance as chairperson of the Asset Management Division. The transformation from Catherine Prestwick, corporate wife, to Catherine Harrington, businesswoman and major shareholder, had not happened overnight. It had been a deliberate, often painful process of reclaiming pieces of myself that had been subsumed during my marriage. If creating this story resonated with you in any way, please hit the subscribe button. It truly means the world to us. and we have many more inspiring journeys to share. Now, let's continue with what happened next. The days immediately following, my divorce from Robert had been the darkest of my life. When he left me for Amber, the devastation wasn't just emotional, it was existential. For 15 years I had defined myself primarily as Mrs. Robert Prestwick, gradually surrendering my own ambitions and interests to support his. The gallery I'd sold, the art history career I'd abandoned, the children we'd postponed until his business was established enough, a benchmark that somehow kept moving, all sacrificed for a partnership that, in the end, proved disposable. I had moved temporarily into a small apartment on Beacon Hill, unable to bear staying in the house we'd shared. In those first weeks, I barely functioned, alternating between paralyzing grief and incandescent rage. I ignored calls from concerned. Friends rebuffed my sister's attempts to coax me out, and sat for hours staring at the walls, replaying moments from my marriage and wondering how I had become so blind to its fundamental imbalance. The turning point came unexpectedly, during a meeting with Walter Harrington, my father's longtime attorney who was helping me navigate the divorce proceedings. We were reviewing financial disclosures when Walter paused, removed his glasses, and fixed me with a penetrating look. "Catherine," he said gently, "your father would be deeply disappointed to see how Robert has treated you. But I think he'd be even more concerned by how you've allowed yourself to be diminished." The words stung precisely because they contained an uncomfortable truth. My father, James Harrington, had been a self-made man who built a successful construction business through determination and integrity. He had raised me to be independent and strong-minded after my mother's early death. He would indeed have been dismayed to see how gradually, almost imperceptibly, I had ceded my autonomy to Robert over the years of our marriage. "The divorce settlement Robert's offering is insulting," Walter continued, tapping the documents before us. "It deliberately excludes your interest in the car collection, despite clear documentation showing your financial contribution. He's betting you'll accept less than you're entitled to just to avoid confrontation." He always said I didn't understand the investment side of his business, I murmured, echoing the dismissive refrain that had become so familiar during our marriage. "Then prove him wrong," Walter said simply. "You're James Harrington's daughter. You have his intelligence and his backbone. It's time you remembered that." That conversation sparked something in me, not just anger, but determination. I spent the next week reviewing every financial document from our marriage, creating timelines of acquisitions and investments, and researching the complex ownership structures Robert had created for his automotive assets. What emerged was a pattern I had been too trusting to recognize. Robert had systematically structured our joint investments to maximize his control while maintaining just enough paperwork linking my contributions to establish legal co-ownership, if ever challenged. Armed with this initial understanding, I did something that would have been unthinkable during my marriage. I assembled my own team of advisors independent of the lawyers handling my divorce. Walter introduced me to Eleanor Chen at Blackwood Partners, a firm specializing in complex asset restructuring. Eleanor, in turn, connected me with financial forensic specialists who could trace the path of investments through multiple shell companies and offshore entities. "What's your ultimate goal here, Catherine?" Eleanor asked during our first serious strategy session, 3 months after Robert had left. "Financial settlement? Control of specific assets? Public vindication?" I considered the question carefully. "Knowledge first," I answered finally. "I need to understand exactly what we built together and my legal standing within it. Then I want recognition. Not just financial compensation, but acknowledgement of my role. And finally, I added, surprising myself with the clarity of my vision, I want to secure enough control to ensure these automotive treasures are properly preserved and appreciated, not just used as status symbols or investment vehicles. Eleanor's approving smile told me I'd given the right answer, one that spoke to genuine values beyond mere revenge. Then we have work to do, she said, and it will take time. What followed was an intensive period of education and preparation. I took courses in business administration and finance at Harvard Extension School. I immersed myself in the world of collector automobiles, moving beyond appreciation of their beauty to understanding their investment characteristics, restoration requirements, and market trends. I learned the difference between investments that appreciated through careful preservation versus those that required strategic enhancement. Most crucially, I began building relationships within the automotive collecting community, not as Robert Prestwick's ex-wife, but as Catherine Harrington, a knowledgeable enthusiast with genuine appreciation for automotive history and design. I attended auctions, restoration workshops, and exclusive rallies, gradually establishing my own reputation separate from Robert's shadow. 18 months after our divorce was finalized, I established Harrington Heritage Fund with the portion of my settlement I had managed to secure, primarily cash and real estate, as Robert had successfully excluded most of the automotive assets from the divorce proceedings. The fund's initial focus was modest, investing in carefully selected automotive restoration projects and providing financing for promising collectors without the resources for major acquisitions. What Robert failed to realize during this period was that I wasn't just developing expertise, I was developing a strategy. Every relationship I cultivated, every detail I learned about the industry, every investment the fund made was part of a larger plan to eventually assert my rightful claim to the collection we had built together. The opportunity came sooner than expected. 2 years after establishing Harrington Heritage Fund, I received a call from Martin Chen, Prestwick Automotive Group's CFO. Catherine, he began hesitantly, I'm not sure I should be telling you this, but I thought you should know. Robert's leveraging the classic collection for a major expansion into the Middle East and Asia. He's using the cars as collateral for significant loans. This was precisely the vulnerability I had been waiting for. Robert's expansion plans had always been ambitious, often requiring creative financing. By using the collection as collateral, he was creating a potential challenge to ownership, one that would require clear documentation of his sole authority to leverage the assets. Thank you, Martin, I replied carefully. That's very interesting information. May I ask why you're sharing this with me? He paused before answering. Because some of us remember that you were there at the beginning. Because the documentation crossing my desk doesn't feel right. And because Robert's been making increasingly risky decisions since you left. That conversation set in motion the final phase of my plan. Working with Eleanor and our legal team, we prepared to challenge Robert's authority to use the collection as collateral without my consent. The documentation we had meticulously assembled over the past 2 years provided the foundation for our case, proof of my financial contributions, co-signatures on original purchase agreements, and my legal standing in the offshore entities that technically owned the vehicles. Rather than immediately filing a lawsuit, however, we approached the situation strategically. Eleanor arranged a meeting with Prestige Global Finance, the institution providing the loans for Robert's expansion. We didn't threaten litigation. We simply presented documentation raising significant questions about the clean title to the collateral Robert was offering. The effect was immediate and devastating. The financing was put on hold pending ownership clarification. Robert's expansion plans, already announced to shareholders and the industry, were suddenly in jeopardy. And for the first time since our divorce, he was forced to acknowledge what he had deliberately overlooked, that I remained, legally and financially, an integral part of the empire he claimed as exclusively his. Which brings us back to the shareholders' meeting and the moment of reckoning 3 years in the making. As I prepared for the emergency board meeting the morning after my dramatic reappearance, I felt a curious sense of calm. The anger and hurt that had initially fueled my journey had been transformed into something more constructive, a commitment to reclaiming not just my place in the company we had built together, but my own identity as a capable, independent woman with expertise and vision of my own. The DB5 purred beneath me as I drove to Prestwick headquarters, its vintage engine a symphony of mechanical precision. I had learned to drive it myself, taking lessons from one of the world's foremost classic car specialists. Another relationship I had cultivated during my reconstruction. The car that Robert had always treated as his most personal possession, the centerpiece of his self-image as a connoisseur and collector, now responded to my touch with eager precision. As I pulled into the reserved parking space that now bore my name, I allowed myself a moment to appreciate the symmetry of the situation. 3 years ago, I had left this building broken and diminished, believing Robert's narrative that I was merely decorative in our shared life. Today, I returned not as his replacement, but as his counterbalance, someone with equal claim to what we had built and a distinct vision for its future. The woman who entered the boardroom that morning was not seeking revenge. She was claiming her rightful place in a world that had tried to render her invisible. And in doing so, she had discovered strengths and capabilities that might have remained dormant had comfort and security not been so abruptly stripped away. The boardroom of Prestwick Automotive Group fell silent as I took my seat at the conference table. 14 pairs of eyes watched my every move, some curious, some wary, a few openly hostile. Robert sat directly across from me, his expression carefully neutral, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his discomfort. Amber was conspicuously absent. Patricia Winters, the lead director, called the emergency board meeting to order with practiced efficiency. Given yesterday's developments regarding ownership of the Prestwick Classic Collection, we've convened to address the restructuring implications and establish a path forward that serves the company's best interests. Eleanor Chen, sitting beside me, opened a leather portfolio containing the documentation we had prepared. Before we begin discussing operational adjustments, I believe it would be beneficial for all board members to review the ownership verification materials we've assembled. These conclusively establish Ms. Harrington's co-ownership of the collection. As the documents circulated around the table, purchase agreements bearing both our signatures, transfer records showing funds from my inheritance, corporate formation paperwork listing me as co-director of the holding entities. I watched Robert's face. His expression shifted from dismissive to concerned as board members examined the evidence with increasing interest. "These appear to be in order," noted Jonathan Pierce, the longest-serving board member. "Robert, were you aware of these ownership structures?" Robert straightened in his chair. "Catherine was listed on certain documents for tax and estate planning purposes," he said smoothly. "It was standard practice recommended by our financial advisors, but the operational control and investment decisions were always exclusively mine." "That's not entirely accurate," I countered, opening my own portfolio. I have correspondence dating back 12 years showing my input on multiple acquisition decisions, including the 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO that currently serves as the cornerstone of the collection. I slid copies of emails across the table, messages I had carefully preserved showing my substantive involvement in key decisions. Additionally, minutes from the offshore holding company's annual meetings show my proxy being exercised, a proxy I granted to Robert based on trust, not lack of legitimate ownership interest. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly as board members began to recognize the strength of my position. This wasn't a vindictive ex-wife making spurious claims. This was a co-founder reclaiming her rightful place in the company she had helped build. The legal standing is clear, Eleanor added. Ms. Harrington's ownership interest is well documented and legally binding. The question before this board isn't whether she has a claim, but how the company will adapt to this clarified ownership structure. Martin Chen, the CFO, who had been reviewing the financial implications, cleared his throat. This complicates our financing arrangements for the international expansion. The lenders were operating under the assumption that Mr. Prestwick had unilateral authority to pledge the collection assets as collateral, which is precisely why immediate restructuring is necessary, I said, my voice steady. The collection represents approximately 65% of this company's tangible assets. Its proper management is fundamental to Prestwick's financial stability and growth potential. Robert leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. Let's be clear about what's happening here. After 3 years of complete disengagement from this company, Catherine has orchestrated this intervention precisely when we're on the verge of our most significant expansion. This isn't about ownership rights. It's about leveraging a technical legal position to disrupt operations. I met his gaze directly. My timing is strategic, yes, but not for the reasons you suggest. I've spent these 3 years developing expertise in automotive asset management and investment. Expertise this company actually needs as it considers expansion. I've established relationships throughout the collector community that complement and extend Prestwick's existing network. What I'm offering isn't disruption, but enhancement. For the next 2 hours, the board engaged in intense discussion about the practical implications of the ownership clarification. Eleanor presented our proposed restructuring plan, emphasizing its minimal disruption to day-to-day operations while ensuring proper oversight of the collection. I outlined my vision for Prestwick's future, demonstrating knowledge that clearly surprised many board members who had known me only as Robert's supportive wife. Throughout this discussion, I could see Robert's initial shock giving way to calculation. He had always been adaptable, skilled at finding advantage in changing circumstances. By the time the board voted unanimously to accept the restructuring proposal, creating the asset management division I would chair while leaving Robert as CEO of operations, he had already begun repositioning himself as a collaborative partner rather than an adversary. Catherine and I may have had our personal differences, he said smoothly as the meeting concluded, but we've always shared a commitment to these extraordinary automobiles. I look forward to working together again in this new capacity. His performance was flawless, his pivot from opposition to acceptance so seamless that several board members visibly relaxed. But I knew Robert too well to be fooled. This wasn't acceptance, it was tactical retreat. He would be looking for ways to undermine my position as soon as the opportunity presented itself. As the board members filed out, Robert lingered, waiting, until we were alone save for Eleanor, who remained protectively at my side. "Impressive maneuvering, Catherine," he said, his tone simultaneously complimentary and condescending. "I wouldn't have thought you had it in you." "That was always your fundamental mistake," I replied. "Underestimating me was a choice you made, because it was convenient, not because there was evidence to support it." His smile tightened. "So what happens now? We pretend to collaborate while looking for ways to undercut each other? That hardly seems productive for the company we both claim to care about." "I'm genuinely committed to collaboration, Robert," I said. "The question is whether you can adapt to working with me as an equal rather than an accessory." He considered this for a moment. "I built this company, Catherine. Whatever legal documents you've produced, whatever technical ownership rights you may have, this company exists because of my vision and my relationships." "You built this company with my support, my capital, and my sacrifice," I corrected him. "The sooner you accept that reality, the sooner we can move forward productively." He shook his head slightly, as if disappointed by my persistence. "I need to prepare for the press conference this afternoon. We should present a united front, don't you think? For the good of the company." "Absolutely," I agreed. "I've already prepared remarks emphasizing our complementary strengths and shared commitment to Prestwick's future." Something flashed across his face. Surprise, perhaps, that I had anticipated this need and taken initiative to address it. Without another word, he turned and left the boardroom, his posture rigid with contained frustration. Eleanor gathered her materials, watching his departure with practiced assessment. "He'll try to isolate you," she observed. "Limit your access to key relationships, control the flow of information, gradually push you back to the periphery. It's already begun." "I know," I replied, remembering all too well how skillfully Robert had marginalized me in our marriage, so gradually I barely noticed until it was complete. "But I'm not the same person he managed to sideline before. And I'm not alone. This time up with the press conference that afternoon was a masterclass in corporate theater." Robert and I stood side by side before a backdrop featuring Prestwick's logo and a tasteful image of the Ferrari 250 GTO that had been our first significant acquisition. Our prepared statements emphasized continuity and enhanced expertise, positioning the restructuring as a natural evolution rather than a dramatic ownership dispute. "Catherine brings valuable perspective and relationships that will complement our existing strengths," Robert told the assembled financial journalists, his hand lightly touching my shoulder in a gesture of collegial respect. "As we expand internationally, her oversight of our core collection assets will ensure their proper management, while allowing operational leadership to focus on growth opportunities." I smiled with practiced warmth. Prestwick Automotive Group has always been about honoring automotive excellence through knowledgeable curation and strategic investment. I'm looking forward to building on that foundation with innovative approaches to asset management and collector education. The questions from journalists were predictably focused on our personal history. The awkwardness of working together after divorce, the surprise of my return after 3 years of absence. We deflected these with practiced ease, maintaining the narrative of professional respect and shared vision despite personal differences. When a particularly persistent reporter from the Wall Street Journal asked about the ownership dispute that had necessitated restructuring, Eleanor smoothly intervened. "There was never a dispute about ownership, merely a clarification of existing legal structures to ensure proper governance as the company enters its next growth phase," she explained. "Both Ms. Harrington and Mr. Prestwick have demonstrated admirable commitment to prioritizing Prestwick's success above personal considerations." As cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes, I maintained my composed smile while inwardly marveling at how completely my life had transformed in the span of 24 hours. After 3 years of methodical preparation, I had stepped back into the spotlight not as Robert Prestwick's ex-wife, but as a financial force in my own right. Someone with expertise, authority, and a legitimate claim to the company we had built together. The days following my dramatic return to Prestwick Automotive Group passed in a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and strategic planning sessions. I established my office in the executive wing, not Robert's corner suite, but a space overlooking the climate-controlled pavilion where the most valuable pieces of the collection were displayed. From my desk, I could see the elegant curves of the Ferrari 250 GTO, its deep red finish gleaming under perfectly calibrated lighting. There was something profoundly satisfying about this view, a daily reminder of both what I had almost lost and what I had reclaimed through determination and strategic patience. The GTO had been the first investment-grade vehicle we purchased, acquired when Prestwick was still operating from a small office with just 3 employees. Robert had recognized its investment potential, but I had been the one to research its provenance, verifying the authenticity of every component and the completeness of its documentation. Ms. Harrington, the restoration team is ready for you in the workshop. My assistant Marcus stood at the door, a young man with meticulous attention to detail and genuine passion for automotive history. I had specifically requested someone with technical knowledge rather than executive experience, wanting an assistant who understood the assets themselves, not just the corporate infrastructure. Thank you, Marcus. And the documentation I requested on the Bugatti collection? On your tablet, organized chronologically with provenance verification highlighted as requested. I nodded appreciatively and gathered my materials. The restoration workshop housed on Prestwick's lower level was where the company's most specialized work took place. The painstaking research and craftsmanship that separated merely valuable automobiles from truly investment-grade assets. As I descended in the private elevator, I reflected on how thoroughly I had prepared for this role during my 3 years away from Prestwick. I had studied under master restorers in Italy and England, learning the exacting standards that determined authenticity and value. I had visited private collections around the world, developing relationships with the often eccentric personalities who dominated the upper echelons of automotive collecting. I had immersed myself in the technical, historical, and financial aspects of the field that Robert had once claimed I could never understand. The workshop was a carefully controlled environment, temperature and humidity regulated to protect delicate materials, lighting designed to reveal the smallest imperfections, specialized tools arranged with surgical precision. At its center stood a partially disassembled 1938 Bugatti Type 57 SC Atlantic, one of only 2 in existence, its value conservatively estimated at over $40 million. The original had been black, but careful analysis had revealed evidence of a striking sapphire blue beneath later paint applications. Thomas Weber, Prestwick's head of restoration and a world-renowned expert, greeted me with respectful warmth. Catherine, thank you for coming down. We've reached a critical decision point with the Atlantic. For the next hour, we discussed the complex considerations of the restoration process, whether to return the vehicle to its original blue finish or maintain the black exterior it had worn for most of its documented history. Each approach had implications for both authenticity and market value. The collector community is divided, Thomas explained, showing me microscopic samples of the original paint discovered during disassembly. Historically, black Atlantics have commanded higher prices, but this particular blue was a special commission for the original owner. Authenticity would suggest returning it to blue, but market expectations favor black. I studied the documentation and paint samples, weighing the competing considerations. "What's Robert's position?" I asked, knowing he would have a strong opinion on a restoration of this significance. Thomas hesitated. "Mr. Prestwick wants the car finished in black, prioritizing immediate market value. He's already discussed potential sale with a buyer in Abu Dhabi who specifically wants a black Atlantic." The information didn't surprise me. Robert had always prioritized market considerations over historical authenticity, a valid approach from a strictly financial perspective, but one that sometimes conflicted with preservation of automotive heritage. "We'll restore it to the original blue," I decided, "and we'll document the process extensively for the collector community. The uniqueness of the color combined with absolute authenticity will ultimately create more value than conforming to market expectations. Please prepare a detailed justification that I can review before discussing with Robert." Thomas's expression revealed both approval and concern. Appreciation for the decision from a preservation standpoint, worry about the inevitable conflict it would create with Robert. "This will delay completion by at least 3 months, he noted. "The buyer in Abu Dhabi has a time frame in mind." "The right buyer will wait for the right car," I replied. "If this particular collector insists on black, there are other investment opportunities we can offer him. The integrity of our restoration standards isn't negotiable." As I left the workshop, I felt a subtle shift in how the specialized team viewed me. Recognition that my decisions were grounded in genuine knowledge rather than arbitrary authority. It was a small victory, but significant in establishing my credibility within the organization Robert had shaped in his image. That credibility would be tested sooner than I anticipated. When I returned to my office, Marcus informed me that Robert had requested an immediate meeting in his office. "He seemed displeased," Marcus added diplomatically. "I imagine he is," I replied. "Please let him know I'll be there in 15 minutes. The delay was deliberate, a small assertion of independence. During our marriage, I had always responded immediately to Robert's summons, rearranging my schedule to accommodate his. Those days were over. Exactly 15 minutes later, I knocked on the door of his corner office and entered without waiting for a response. Another small but meaningful deviation from our past pattern of interaction. Robert was on the phone but gestured for me to sit. I remained standing, using the opportunity to study the changes he had made to his workspace. The office was more aggressively masculine than it had been during our marriage. Darker woods, heavier furniture, more obvious displays of success and connection. Photos showed Robert with celebrities and business titans standing beside rare automobiles at prestigious events worldwide. Notably absent were any personal touches, family photos, mementos, or objects chosen for sentimental rather than impressive value. "I'll call you back," he said abruptly into the phone before setting it down and turning his attention to me. "You've reversed my decision on the Atlantic restoration." "I've made a decision based on historical authenticity and long-term value preservation," I corrected. "The original commission was for blue. We restore to original specifications. That's the standard for investment-grade vehicles." His expression hardened. "The Sheikh has specifically requested a black Atlantic. He's prepared to pay $7 million above market valuation for expedited completion. And I've instructed Thomas to explore alternative investment opportunities we can offer him," I replied. The Blue Atlantic will command a premium from collectors who value authenticity, potentially more than the short-term premium the Sheikh is offering. Robert leaned back in his chair, studying me with narrowed eyes. This isn't about authenticity or market value. This is about establishing your authority, countermanding my decision to demonstrate you're in control of the collection now. There was a kernel of truth in his accusation, but not in the way he meant it. This is about demonstrating that decisions regarding the collection will be made based on expertise and long-term value preservation, not immediate sales opportunities. That's precisely why the asset management division was created. He sighed with exaggerated patience. Catherine, you've been back at Prestwick for exactly 5 days. I've spent 15 years building relationships with the world's most discerning collectors. The Sheikh isn't just any buyer. He represents access to an entire network of ultra-high net worth individuals throughout the Middle East. Disappointing him has implications beyond this single transaction. It was the same tone he had used throughout our marriage when explaining why my perspective was limited, why his judgment should prevail. Reasonable on the surface, but fundamentally dismissive. I understand the relationship considerations, I replied, maintaining my composure. Which is why I've already asked Marcus to prepare a portfolio of alternative investment opportunities we can present to the Sheikh. Opportunities that align with his collection goals without compromising our restoration standards. Robert's surprise was momentarily visible before he masked it. He hadn't expected me to have anticipated this objection or prepared a solution. I'd like to review that portfolio before it's presented, he said, his tone shifting to something more collegial. I know the Sheikh's preferences intimately. Of course, I agreed. I welcome your input on client relationships. That's an area where your expertise is invaluable. The subtle repositioning wasn't lost on Robert. My acknowledgement of his expertise in client relationships implicitly defining it as only one component of Prestwick's success, not its entirety. We need to establish clearer communication protocols, he said after a moment. Major decisions affecting client relationships should be discussed jointly before implementation. I agree completely, I replied. I've scheduled a weekly coordination meeting for our leadership teams beginning next Monday. We'll establish formal processes for decisions that cross our respective areas of authority. Again, I had anticipated his move and prepared a response that demonstrated forethought and leadership rather than reactivity. It was a subtle, but important shift in our dynamic. I was no longer responding to his initiatives but initiating my own with equal authority. As I left his office, I felt his gaze following me, reassessing me in light of these interactions. The Catherine he had married, supportive, deferential, allowing him to shine while remaining in the background, had been replaced by someone who matched his strategic thinking and executive presence. I had become, in essence, a formidable counterpart, rather than a compliant partner. The next weeks brought similar tests and adjustments as we established a new working relationship. Robert's initial strategy was predictable. He attempted to isolate me from key client relationships, scheduled important meetings when he knew I had conflicts, and subtly implied to long-standing clients that my role was primarily ceremonial, a necessary accommodation following a misunderstanding about ownership structures. I countered by building my own relationships throughout the organization, particularly with the technical and curatorial staff who had often felt undervalued by Robert's sales-driven approach. I established direct communication with key collectors who appreciated speaking with someone who understood the historical and mechanical aspects of their investments, not just their financial potential. Most importantly, I demonstrated consistent expertise that couldn't be dismissed as beginner's enthusiasm or surface knowledge. 6 weeks after my return, I achieved my first significant victory in an unexpected area. Thomas Weber, our restoration chief, approached me privately with concerns about authentication documentation for 3 recent high-profile acquisitions. The provenance paperwork is incomplete, he explained, showing me the files. There are gaps in the ownership history for these vehicles that would normally disqualify them from investment-grade classification, yet they've been certified and added to client portfolios with full valuation. The implications were serious. Prestwick's reputation was built on absolute verification of authenticity and provenance. Any compromise in these standards posed both financial and reputational risk. Who authorized the certification? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Mr. Prestwick personally signed off on all three, Thomas confirmed. He said the documentation gaps were addressed through his personal research, but that research isn't included in the files. I studied the paperwork carefully. The vehicles in question, a 1957 Ferrari Testarossa, a 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, and a 1967 Lamborghini Miura P400, were all exceptional examples worth multiple millions. But their value depended entirely on authenticated provenance. These certification exceptions weren't brought to the Asset Management Division for review, I noted. When were they processed? Within the past 3 months, Thomas replied, just before your return. The timing suggested Robert had rushed these certifications through, perhaps anticipating that my oversight would create additional scrutiny. It was a serious lapse in protocol, regardless of whether his personal research had actually addressed the provenance gaps. Rather than confronting Robert immediately, I took a more strategic approach. I assembled a team of Prestwick's best researchers and outside authentication experts to conduct a thorough review of the vehicle's histories, instructing them to document every step of their process and findings. 2 weeks later, the results confirmed my concerns. While the Ferrari and Mercedes histories could be verified through additional research, the Lamborghini's provenance contained critical inconsistencies that suggested it had been improperly restored using non-original components, a fatal flaw for investment-grade classification. Armed with comprehensive documentation, I scheduled a meeting with Robert and Martin Chen, our CFO, to address the issue. I presented the findings methodically, focusing on the systemic risk rather than personal criticism. The valuation of the Miura will need to be adjusted by approximately 40% to reflect its compromised provenance, I concluded, and will need to disclose this reassessment to the client immediately. Robert's face had gradually darkened as I presented the evidence. The buyer has already taken possession, he pointed out. This reassessment will damage a critical relationship and potentially expose us to liability. Failing to disclose would expose us to greater liability and potentially damage our reputation with all clients, I countered. Our certification standards are the foundation of our business model. They cannot be compromised, even for important relationships. Martin, reviewing the financial implications, looked grave. The client paid $8 million. A 40% reduction means we need to offer compensation of over $1 million. Or accept the return of the vehicle, I added. Either way, we need to address this immediately and transparently. Robert's expression shifted from opposition to calculation. He recognized that I had documented the issue too thoroughly for it to be dismissed or buried. More importantly, I had approached it as a business risk requiring mitigation rather than a personal failing to be exposed. I'll speak with the client personally, he finally conceded. We'll offer either a partial refund or advantageous terms on their next acquisition. Martin, prepare the financial options. He turned to me with reluctant acknowledgement. The authentication protocols will be reviewed and strengthened as you've recommended. It was a significant victory, not just in addressing this specific issue but in establishing my authority in core aspects of Prestwick's operations. By focusing on systemic improvement rather than blame, I had demonstrated leadership that even Robert couldn't dismiss. As I left the meeting, Martin fell into step beside me in the corridor. "That was impressively handled," he said quietly. There aren't many people who can present Robert with his mistakes and leave with his cooperation rather than his enmity. "It wasn't about his mistakes," I replied. "It was about our standards as a company. Those transcend any individual, including both of us." Martin studied me with newfound respect. "You've changed, Catherine, not just professionally, but personally." "Necessity is transformative," I said with a slight smile. "When everything familiar is stripped away, you discover capabilities you never knew you had." 3 months into my new role at Prestwick Automotive Group, I found myself in Milan for the prestigious Concorso d'Eleganza Villa d'Este, one of the world's most exclusive automotive events, where only the rarest and most magnificent vehicles were invited to compete. The setting was breathtaking. A 16th-century villa overlooking Lake Como, its manicured grounds transformed into a showcase for automotive masterpieces spanning a century of design and innovation. This was my first international appearance representing Prestwick without Robert by my side. He had always been the company's public face at such events, charming potential clients and cultivating relationships with collectors, while I had traditionally played the supporting role, the elegant wife who remembered personal details and facilitated social connections. Today, I was here on my own merit, as chairperson of Prestwick's Asset Management Division and the recognized curator of one of the world's finest automotive collections. The transformation was not lost on the tight-knit community of high-end collectors and industry insiders who circulated among the priceless automobiles. "Catherine Harrington," called a familiar voice as I admired a perfectly preserved 1938 Alfa Romeo 8C 2900B Touring Berlinetta. I turned to find Heinrich Müller, one of Europe's most respected automotive historians and a notoriously exacting judge of both cars and people. "Your Blue Atlantic is causing quite the stir in restoration circles," he said, referring to the Bugatti we had decided to return to its original color against Robert's wishes. "Bold choice, prioritizing historical authenticity over market convention." "The right decision isn't always the easy one," I replied, "especially when short-term gains compete with long-term values." Heinrich's eyes twinkled with appreciation for the double meaning. "Indeed. And how is Robert adjusting to your partnership?" "We're finding our equilibrium," I said diplomatically. "Complementary perspectives can strengthen an organization even when they occasionally conflict." "Diplomatic as always," Heinrich chuckled, "but I've known you both for many years." Robert built Prestwick through relentless determination and charm, but the collection itself, its coherence, its historical significance beyond mere financial value, that always struck me as your influence, even when you were in the background. His observation touched me unexpectedly. During my years as Robert's wife, few had recognized my contributions so directly. "The Prestwick collection tells a story about automotive evolution," I acknowledged. "That narrative perspective was something I brought to our acquisitions, yes." "And now you're writing the next chapter," Heinrich observed. "I'm curious to see where you take it." As we spoke, I noticed a stir near the entrance to the villa gardens. Robert had arrived, impeccably dressed in a bespoke Italian suit, with Amber on his arm wearing a designer dress that seemed calculated to draw every eye. The contrast between her youth and the timeless automobiles surrounding her created an almost jarring dissonance. "Ah, speaking of your former husband," Heinrich murmured. "He seems determined to make an entrance." Indeed, Robert was moving through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and introducing Amber to key industry figures. His body language was deliberately expansive, commanding attention, while Amber smiled with rehearsed charm beside him. "If you'll excuse me," I said to Heinrich, "I should greet some of our clients." "Of course," he replied with a knowing smile. The chess match continues. For the next hour, I navigated the event with careful strategy, connecting with important collectors and industry influencers while maintaining a respectful distance from Robert and Amber. I didn't need to compete for attention. My goal was to establish myself as a knowledgeable authority in my own right, not a rival for Robert's spotlight. The approach paid dividends when Enrique Montoya, a reclusive Spanish collector with one of the world's finest Ferrari collections, sought me out specifically. "Ms. Harrington," he said in his accented English, "I was impressed by your article in Classic Automobile Quarterly about preservation ethics versus restoration purity. Few executives in this industry engage with such philosophical questions in a meaningful way. During my 3 years away from Prestwick, I had written several scholarly articles on automotive history and preservation philosophy, part of my strategy to establish independent credibility in the field. That Montoya had not only read, but appreciated these contributions was significant. "Thank you," I replied. "Those questions become increasingly important as these vehicles transition from beautiful machines to historical artifacts. How we preserve them shapes what future generations will understand about this revolutionary period in design and engineering." "Precisely," Montoya agreed enthusiastically, "which is why I have been contemplating the future of my collection. At 76, I must consider its legacy beyond my lifetime." This was an extraordinary opening. Montoya's collection of early Ferraris was valued at over $180 million and coveted by museums and private collectors worldwide. That he was raising the subject of its disposition with me rather than Robert, who had been cultivating a relationship with him for years, represented a seismic shift in Prestwick's client dynamics. "Legacy planning requires balancing many considerations," I said carefully. "Preservation of the collection's integrity, financial implications for heirs, cultural access versus private appreciation." "You understand the complexities," Montoya nodded. "I would value your perspective on these matters. Perhaps we could discuss further when we are both back in more private surroundings." "I would be honored," I replied, exchanging contact information and promising to arrange a meeting. At his convenience. As Montoya departed, I caught Robert watching our interaction from across the garden, his expression unreadable, but his attention unmistakably focused. Amber was speaking animatedly to a younger man beside him, but Robert's gaze remained fixed on me. Later that evening, during the gala dinner held on the villa's lakeside terrace, Robert maneuvered to sit at my table while Amber was engaged in conversation elsewhere. He was nothing if not strategic in his social movements. "You've made quite an impression on Montoya," he observed, his tone casual but his interest keen. "He's notoriously selective about who he engages with regarding his collection." "We share similar perspectives on preservation philosophy," I replied. "It makes for natural connection." Robert swirled the wine in his glass thoughtfully. "He's been considering the future of his collection for years. I've been cultivating that relationship since before our divorce." The implication was clear. He viewed Montoya as his client, his prospect, his territory. I didn't seek him out, Robert. He approached me specifically to discuss my article in CAC. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or reassessment. I wasn't aware you were publishing in the field. There's a lot you weren't aware of about me, I replied simply, both during our marriage and after. He studied me, with new attention, as if seeing aspects of me that had previously been invisible to him. You've built yourself into someone entirely new, haven't you? The observation seemed genuine rather than calculated. A rare moment of true perception from a man who had often seen me as an extension of himself rather than an individual with independent depth and capability. Not new, I corrected him. Just more fully realized. These aspects of me were always there, Robert. You simply never had reason to look for them. Our conversation was interrupted by the event chairman calling for attention as the evening's awards were about to be announced. The blue Bugatti Atlantic we had entered, now fully restored to its original sapphire glory, was a finalist in the preservation class. When it was announced as the winner, the applause was enthusiastic. The judges specifically cited the courage of returning the vehicle to its original, historically documented specification, rather than maintaining the more commercially conventional black finish it had worn in later years. Robert had once told me I would never understand his world. He couldn't have imagined that in forcing me out of it, he had inadvertently given me the opportunity to understand it more deeply and authentically than I ever could have as his wife. The ultimate irony was that in attempting to exclude me from Prestwick's legacy, he had created the conditions that would indelibly link my name to its most significant evolution. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: negotiations with Montoya, ongoing navigation of the complex dynamics with Robert, strategic decisions about Prestwick's future direction. But as I drifted toward sleep, I felt only appreciation for the journey that had brought me here, and anticipation for the path still unfolding before me. The morning of my meeting with Enrique Montoya dawned with surprising serenity given the stakes involved. I had deliberately scheduled our discussion at the Museum of Fine Arts, rather than Prestwick headquarters, neutral territory where we could speak freely, surrounded by other forms of artistic expression that complemented the automotive masterpieces we would be discussing. The museum was nearly empty at this early hour, our footsteps echoing through the high-ceilinged European paintings gallery where Montoya had requested we meet. At 76, he moved with deliberate grace, pausing occasionally to study a particular canvas with the same meticulous attention he devoted to his Ferrari collection. Vermeer understood light in ways few other painters have matched. He observed, gesturing toward a small but luminous interior scene. The way it reveals texture, creates dimension, transforms ordinary moments into something transcendent. Much like Enzo Ferrari understood the relationship between form and function. The comparison was unexpectedly poetic from a man known primarily for his business acumen and collecting precision. Both understood that technical mastery serves emotional impact, I agreed. The best Ferraris, like the best paintings, move us beyond appreciation of skill to something deeper. Montoya smiled, pleased by the response. You see it. Not everyone does. He turned from the painting to face me directly. That's why I wanted to speak with you about my collection, Catherine. Many understand its financial value. Few appreciate its cultural significance. For the next hour, as we wandered through the quiet galleries, Montoya shared his vision for the future of his magnificent collection of early Ferraris. 23 impeccable examples tracing the evolution of the marque from its earliest racing, successes through its emergence as the definitive expression of automotive art. I have no children, he explained. No direct heirs to continue the stewardship. My nephew has interest only in what these cars might sell for, not what they represent historically. The collection tells a coherent story, I observed. Separating the vehicles would diminish their collective significance. Precisely. He stopped before a dramatic Caravaggio, the painting's stark contrasts of light and shadow mirroring the seriousness of our discussion. Which brings me to the purpose of our meeting. I am considering establishing a foundation to maintain the collection intact after my death, with Prestwick Automotive Group as the designated curatorial manager. The proposal was extraordinary, potentially the most significant development in Prestwick's history. Management of the Montoya collection would cement our position as the preeminent authority in Ferrari preservation, while creating a sustainable revenue stream through the Foundation's management fees. I'm deeply honored by your trust, I replied, careful to acknowledge the personal nature of his consideration. May I ask what's guiding your thinking toward Prestwick specifically? Montoya's expression became more measured. I have explored several options over the years. Museums lack the specialized expertise these vehicles require. Auction houses would inevitably pressure my estate toward liquidation. Other management firms— He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Lack the philosophical foundation I've observed in your approach. He turned to face me directly. To be candid, I would not have considered Prestwick under Robert's sole leadership. His commercialization priorities, while financially successful, didn't align with my preservation values. Your influence has created a more balanced approach that better serves these historical treasures. The assessment was forthright and perceptive. More significantly, it validated everything I had worked to establish since returning to Prestwick. A leadership philosophy that balanced commercial viability with cultural stewardship, market awareness with historical respect. If Prestwick were entrusted with your collection, I asked, what would your primary expectations be for its management? The question launched us into a detailed discussion of preservation standards, exhibition philosophy, research access, and financial structures. Montoya had clearly given substantial thought to these considerations, outlining specific requirements that would ensure his collection remained both physically preserved and intellectually accessible. As our meeting concluded in the museum's sunlit courtyard, Montoya extended his hand with formal dignity. I will be sending my attorneys a directive to begin drafting the foundation structure with Prestwick as the designated curatorial manager. There will be much to discuss in the coming months. The significance of his decision wasn't lost on by me. This wasn't merely a business arrangement, but a profound act of trust, entrusting the legacy of his life's passion to an organization he believed would honor both the technical perfection and emotional resonance of these extraordinary machines. We will justify your confidence, I assured him, and honor the spirit of your collection as well as its material needs. His smile suggested he had expected nothing less. You understand what many collectors never grasp, Catherine. We don't truly own these treasures. We merely serve as their temporary guardians. Our responsibility is to preserve them for future generations, who will find in them the same beauty and inspiration that we have. As I watched him depart, I felt a profound sense of alignment with his perspective. The philosophy he had articulated— stewardship rather than ownership, preservation rather than exploitation— was precisely what I had been working to instill at Prestwick since my return. That Montoya had recognized and valued this approach represented validation of the most meaningful kind. The drive back to Prestwick headquarters gave me time to consider how best to share this development with the executive team, and particularly with Robert, who had been cultivating Montoya for years without securing this level of commitment. The news would inevitably shift the balance of perceived value within the organization, demonstrating that my approach to client relationships, while different from Robert's, could yield significant results. I had just settled at my desk to draft a preliminary memo when Marcus appeared at my door, his expression uncharacteristically concerned. "Ms. Harrington, there's been an incident at the restoration workshop. Mr. Weber asked that you come immediately." The urgency in his tone was alarming. Thomas Weber was the most composed professional I knew. If he was requesting immediate intervention, the situation must be serious. "What kind of incident?" I asked, already gathering my things. Mr. Prestwick and Mr. Weber had a disagreement about the Daytona prototype. It became heated. This was unexpected. Though Robert and I occasionally had philosophical differences about restoration approaches, he generally respected the technical expertise of our restoration team, particularly Thomas's unparalleled knowledge. When I reached the workshop level, the atmosphere was palpably tense. Staff members were working with unusual quietness, their focus too deliberate, too careful, the workspace equivalent of a forced smile at an awkward dinner party. Thomas met me at the secure entrance, his normally immaculate lab coat showing signs of a physical struggle. "What happened?" I asked as he escorted me toward his office. "Mr. Prestwick arrived with a client, Sheikh Al-Thani from Qatar. They wanted to view the Daytona prototype restoration progress." Thomas's voice was tight with controlled anger. "The Sheikh expressed interest in purchasing it once completed. When I explained it wasn't designated for sale, but for our permanent collection, Mr. Prestwick overrode me and told the Sheikh he could make it happen." We entered Thomas's office, where he closed the door before continuing. When I attempted to clarify that the vehicle's historical significance made it inappropriate for private sale, Mr. Prestwick became agitated. He accused me of exceeding my authority and undermining a critical client relationship. The 1967 Ferrari Daytona prototype was a historically irreplaceable vehicle, the developmental precursor to one of Ferrari's most iconic models. We had acquired it from a private European collection the previous year after extensive authentication work. Given its unique historical significance, the acquisition committee had unanimously designated it for Prestwick's permanent educational collection rather than for resale. "Was the confrontation physical?" I asked, noticing again the disarray of Thomas's usually pristine appearance. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Mr. Prestwick attempted to access the vehicle documentation that I had refused to show the Sheikh. I prevented him from taking files from my desk. There was a brief physical interaction. The situation was more serious than I had initially realized. A physical confrontation between our CEO and our head of restoration wasn't merely a personnel issue. It represented a fundamental breakdown in organizational structure and professional boundaries. "Where is Robert now?" "He left with the Sheikh about 20 minutes ago. He instructed me to prepare the Daytona's documentation for potential sale review by tomorrow morning." I took a measured breath, considering the most constructive approach to this volatile situation. "Show me the Daytona, please." Thomas led me through the workshop to a separate climate-controlled room where the prototype rested in partially restored condition. Even in this intermediate state, its significance was unmistakable. The distinctive bodywork showing the evolutionary design process that would lead to one of Ferrari's most celebrated models. "We've confirmed its provenance conclusively," Thomas explained, his professional passion temporarily overriding his distress about the confrontation. "The chassis and engine numbers match Ferrari factory records. The body was hand-formed by Scaglietti himself. There's documented evidence of Enzo Ferrari personally inspecting this vehicle during development." I studied the car carefully, appreciating both its historical importance and its potential market value. In the current collector climate, a vehicle of this rarity and significance could easily command 8 figures, perhaps approaching $20 million to the right buyer. Sheikh Al-Thani, with his virtually unlimited resources and competitive collecting instincts, would likely pay a substantial premium to acquire such a trophy. The commercial temptation was obvious, but so was the historical loss if this unique piece of automotive development history disappeared into a private collection, potentially unseen for decades. The Acquisition Committee's designation of the II Daytona for our permanent collection was unanimous and properly documented, I confirmed. "Yes," Thomas replied. "The minutes explicitly note its status as a non-sale educational asset. Mr. Prestwick himself signed off on this designation during acquisition approval." This detail was crucial. Robert hadn't merely overridden a curatorial decision. He had contradicted his own prior position, likely in the heat of the moment while trying to impress a valuable client. "Proceed with the restoration as planned," I instructed. "If Robert returns or contacts you about the documentation, refer him to me. Don't discuss this incident with anyone else for now." As I left the restoration facility, I called Eleanor Chen for legal counsel on the situation. This wasn't merely an operational disagreement, but potentially a governance issue involving clear documentation being disregarded for short-term commercial advantage. Eleanor's advice was characteristically straightforward. Document everything about the incident and the vehicle's designated status. We need to address this immediately before Robert makes promises to the Sheikh that conflict with established policy. By the time I returned to my office, Robert had already left a series of increasingly urgent messages requesting an immediate meeting. Rather than responding directly, I spent the next hour assembling comprehensive documentation on the Daytona prototype, its acquisition approval, the committee minutes designating it for the permanent collection, the educational plans, incorporating it into our museum initiative, and Thomas's incident report detailing the confrontation. Armed with this documentation, I finally returned Robert's call, suggesting we meet at a small private dining room at the Four Seasons rather than at Prestwick offices. The neutral location would help maintain professional composure during what would inevitably be a difficult conversation. When I arrived at the hotel, Robert was already waiting, his outward appearance as impeccable as always, though the tension in his posture was evident. He rose as I approached, his expression a carefully controlled mixture of irritation and attempted conciliation. "This situation with Weber has been blown out of proportion," he began without preamble as soon as we were seated. He was insubordinate and obstructive with a critical client present. "Thomas was enforcing a documented designation that you yourself approved," I replied, opening my portfolio to display the Acquisition Committee minutes with Robert's signature clearly visible. "The Daytona prototype was specifically acquired as a non-sale educational asset for our permanent collection." Robert dismissed this with an impatient gesture. "Market conditions change. The Sheikh is prepared to pay substantially above current valuation, perhaps 25% premium. That creates a fiduciary obligation to consider the offer." "Our fiduciary obligation extends beyond immediate financial returns," I countered. The Daytona's educational and reputational value to Prestwick long-term exceeds even a premium sale. Price. More importantly, physically confronting a senior employee for enforcing established policy is completely unacceptable. Robert's expression hardened. Weber exaggerated what happened. I reached for documentation he was withholding and he overreacted. Rather than arguing this point, which would inevitably devolve into competing narratives, I focused on the underlying issue. The Daytona isn't for sale, Robert. Not to the sheikh, not to anyone. Its designation as a permanent collection piece was properly established and documented. Attempting to override that designation without committee review undermines our governance structure and our credibility. The sheikh will go elsewhere if we don't accommodate him, Robert warned. He's considering a significant portfolio expansion that would generate millions in management fees. Then we'll help him acquire something appropriate, I replied. Something that isn't already designated for our educational collection. Something that doesn't compromise our institutional integrity to sell. We continued this tense discussion through dinner, the underlying issue evolving from the specific Daytona situation to a more fundamental question of leadership philosophy. Robert's approach prioritized client relationships and immediate financial opportunity. Mine emphasized institutional integrity and long-term reputation. Both perspectives had validity, but in this specific case, the documented designation of the Daytona gave my position the stronger foundation. By the time dessert arrived, Robert had recognized the untenable nature of his position. The documented committee decision, combined with the problematic nature of his confrontation with Thomas, left him little room to maneuver. "I'll speak with the sheikh," he finally conceded. "I'll explain that the Daytona isn't available but offer to help him locate an comparable significant Ferrari for his collection." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely appreciative of his willingness to resolve the situation constructively. "I think that's the right approach for everyone involved." As we prepared to leave, Robert paused, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "You've become quite formidable, Catherine," he observed. "I'm not sure I would have recognized this version of you 3 years ago. I'm not sure I would have recognized myself," I acknowledged. Loss has a way of revealing what's essential and what's merely habitual. I lost the habit of deferring to your judgment and discovered I had perfectly sound judgment of my own. He absorbed this with surprising thoughtfulness. "For what it's worth, I never doubted your intelligence. I just never saw you apply it in business contexts until recently." "Because you never created space for that possibility," I pointed out. "You saw what you expected to see, a supportive wife, not a potential business equal. And now, we're finding equilibrium as colleagues with different strengths and perspectives. When we manage that successfully, Prestwick benefits. When we don't—" I gestured vaguely, indicating the tension we'd just navigated. As we walked toward the hotel entrance, Robert asked unexpectedly, "Are you happier now, Catherine? Not professionally, I can see that clearly enough. But personally?" The question caught me off guard with its apparent sincerity. After a moment's reflection, I answered truthfully, "I'm more myself now, more fully realized. Whether that's happier in the conventional sense, I'm not sure. But it's more authentic and ultimately more satisfying." He nodded, seeming to genuinely consider this response. "Amber struggles with defining herself beyond our relationship," he admitted, surprising me with this glimpse of vulnerability. "She's intelligent and capable, but she hasn't found her independent purpose." "That's a difficult space to occupy," I acknowledged. remembering my own struggles after our separation. Identity that's primarily relational is fragile. It depends on someone else's continuing validation. Robert looked at me with newfound respect. You've discovered something most people never grasp, Catherine. True security doesn't come from relationships or possessions. It comes from knowing your own capabilities and values. As we parted ways outside the hotel, I realized how profoundly our dynamic had evolved. The man who had once dismissed my business understanding now acknowledged my philosophical insights. The woman who had once shaped her identity around his needs now defined herself through independent achievement and principle. The following week brought the formal announcement of the Montoya Collection Management Agreement, a development that sent ripples throughout the automotive collecting world and substantially elevated Prestwick's already prestigious reputation. The press release carefully credited both Robert and me as key relationships in securing this landmark arrangement, though Montoya had privately indicated my approach had been the deciding factor. In the wake of this announcement and the resolved Daytona situation, something subtle but significant shifted in Prestwick's organizational culture. The tension that had existed between Robert's team and mine, between commercial priorities and curatorial values, began to dissolve into a more integrated perspective that recognized the complementary nature of both approaches. This evolution became evident during the planning meetings for our museum initiative, which had expanded to incorporate rotating exhibits from the Montoya collection. Robert, who had initially viewed the museum concept as a prestige project rather than a core business function, became increasingly engaged with its educational potential. What if we created an interactive element showing how engineering solutions evolved across different marques and eras? He suggested during one particularly productive session. Helping visitors understand how competition drove innovation, how racing technology eventually influenced production vehicles. His suggestion reflected genuine engagement with the educational mission, a departure from his traditionally sales-focused approach. When I acknowledged the value of his idea, his response indicated how our professional relationship had matured. "We're better together than either of us would be alone," he observed. "My market instincts, your preservation philosophy, it's a more complete vision than either perspective in isolation." That evening, driving the DB5 along my favorite coastal route, I reflected on how thoroughly my life had transformed since that first dramatic shareholders meeting. I had achieved everything I had strategically positioned myself to reclaim: my rightful ownership recognition, my professional standing, my independent identity. But something unexpected had emerged alongside these anticipated victories: a genuine appreciation for the complementary strengths Robert and I brought to Prestwick when we managed to collaborate rather than compete. This wasn't the fairy tale reconciliation that Hollywood might have scripted. Robert remained married to Amber, and I had no interest in resurrecting our personal relationship. But we had achieved something perhaps more meaningful in the long run: a professional partnership based on earned respect rather than emotional attachment or legal obligation. As I guided the powerful vehicle through the gathering twilight, I thought about the many forms restoration can take. In the workshop, Thomas and his team meticulously returned priceless automobiles to their authentic, original condition, preserving their historical integrity while ensuring their continued function. In my own life, the restoration process had been equally painstaking, reclaiming pieces of myself that had been neglected or suppressed, rediscovering capabilities that had remained dormant during my marriage, rebuilding confidence that had been systematically undermined. But restoration wasn't about returning to some previous state. The blue Bugatti Atlantic that had won at Villa d'Este wasn't merely returned to its original condition. It was enhanced through deeper historical understanding, improved preservation techniques, and greater appreciation of its cultural significance. Similarly, the Catherine Harrington who now steered Prestwick's asset management division wasn't simply a restored version of my pre-marriage self, but someone more fully developed through challenge and conscious growth. 6 months after my dramatics return to Prestwick, I hosted a small dinner gathering at my Boston apartment to celebrate the museum initiative groundbreaking. The guest list was deliberately intimate. Eleanor Chen and her husband, Thomas Weber, Martin Chen, and a few other key colleagues who had been particularly supportive during my reintegration into Prestwick leadership. As we enjoyed dinner overlooking the harbor lights, Eleanor raised her glass in an unexpected toast to Catherine, who reminds us all that our greatest setbacks often contain the seeds of our most significant growth. The sentiment touched me deeply, echoing as it did my father's wisdom about resilience emerging from loss. As conversations flowed around me, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment of quiet celebration. 3 years earlier, I had sat alone in a stark apartment, shattered by betrayal and loss, unable to imagine a future beyond the pain of rejection. The woman hosting this confident gathering of peers and colleagues would have seemed like a stranger to that broken person, someone from an alternate reality where loss led to discovery rather than destruction. Yet here I was, transformed not despite that devastating experience, but because of how I had chosen to respond to it. I had refused to accept the narrative Robert constructed, that I was merely decorative, intellectually unequipped for the business world he inhabited. Instead, I had methodically rebuilt myself through education, strategic relationship development, and unwavering commitment to reclaiming what was rightfully mine. The results of that transformation extended far beyond my personal vindication. Prestwick itself had evolved into a more balanced organization, combining commercial success with cultural stewardship in ways that strengthened its market position while honoring its educational responsibilities. The Montoya Collection Management Agreement had elevated our standing in the collector community while creating sustainable revenue streams. The museum initiative was already attracting international attention for its innovative approach to automotive history and preservation education. None of these developments would have occurred without the catalyst of personal betrayal that had forced me to discover capabilities I might never have claimed otherwise. The painful ending of my marriage had ultimately created space for a more authentic and impactful life, professionally, intellectually, and personally. As my guests departed later that evening, Thomas Weber lingered briefly, holding a small package. "This is perhaps unconventional," he said with characteristic precision, "but I wanted you to have this." Inside the carefully wrapped box was a crystal model of the blue Bugatti Atlantic, exquisitely detailed and mounted on a simple base inscribed with words that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. For Catherine Harrington, who taught us that authenticity ultimately creates the greatest value. "The restoration team wanted you to have this," Thomas explained. "Your decision on the Atlantic's color wasn't just about a car. It was about prioritizing historical truth over market convention. That principle has transformed our work throughout the department." As I placed the crystal model on my mantle, after Thomas departed, I was struck by how perfectly it symbolized the journey I had undertaken. Like the Atlantic, I had been returned to my authentic self, not the version others found most commercially viable or conventionally appealing, but the genuine expression of my capabilities and values. The woman who had once defined herself primarily as Robert Prestwick's wife now stood confidently as Catherine Harrington, recognized authority in automotive preservation, respected business leader, and architect of her own carefully restored life. Outside my window, the vintage Aston Martin DB5 gleamed in the security lighting of my reserved parking space. No longer merely a symbol of Robert's passion, but a vehicle I understood, appreciated, and drove with confident skill. The perfect metaphor for a life reclaimed through determination, strategic patience, and the courage to discover capabilities that had always existed beneath the surface, waiting for the opportunity to emerge. Robert had been right about one thing. Luxury cars weren't just transportation, but expressions of human ingenuity, artistic vision, and evolutionary progress. What he hadn't understood was that the same could be said of human lives, particularly lives that had weathered damage and emerged stronger, more authentic, and more purposeful through careful, deliberate restoration. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught a final glimpse of the crystal Bugatti glinting in the dim light, a reminder that sometimes we must return to our original design, our authentic selves, to discover our true value. The journey from betrayal to triumph hadn't been easy or direct, but standing now at its culmination, I wouldn't have chosen any other path. For it was precisely through losing everything I thought defined me that I had discovered who I truly was, and who I could become when necessity stripped away all pretense and revealed the strength that had always existed at my core. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us!